Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the House of the Americas. Before we begin, I would like to advise that simultaneous interpretation is available in Spanish and English. If you would like to have a headset, you can collect one from the back of either side of the room or ask the room attendants to provide you with one. We are gathered here today for a special occasion, to celebrate a historic milestone for our hemisphere, the 24th anniversary of the signing of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Adopted in Lima, Peru, on September 11, 2001, the Charter reaffirmed our region's shared commitment to democracy as the foundation for peace, prosperity, and human development. It reminds us that democracy is not only a political system, but a way of life that enables inclusion, dialogue, and progress for all. As Article 26 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter reminds us, promoting a democratic culture is a shared responsibility. It calls upon all of us, governments, institutions, and citizens, to strengthen the values and practices that sustain democracy in our societies. This event is hosted by the Organization of American States in collaboration with International IDEA and with the generous support of the Embassy of Switzerland to the United States. We deeply appreciate their partnership and commitment to promoting democratic values and the principles enshrined in the Charter. To officially open our event, it is my honor to invite to the stage the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, His Excellency Albert Roundin.
Good morning. Buenos dias. Oh, okay. Just want to make sure. I have the Inter-American Democratic Charter right here. I walk with it every day. And in the past couple of days, we had to open it a couple of times. I want to greet, of course, the chairman of the Permanent Council, Ambassador Pascual, permanent representatives and permanent observers, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of Switzerland to the United States, Mr. Adrian Aury, Assistant Secretary General Gil. A special welcome to the Professor and the Nobel Laureate Daron Acemoglu, representatives of the Inter-American Development Bank, representatives of the Atlantic Council and IDEA, and thank you very much for partnering with the OAS in organizing this event. Our colleagues of the Secretariat, and I want to thank upfront the Secretariat for Democracy for organizing this event, this important event. It is indeed a privilege to open this event, marking the anniversary of one of the most meaningful hemispheric instruments in the history of the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Allow me to thank our co-host, International IDEA, and the Embassy of Switzerland for joining us in this celebration of democracy and democratic governance in the Americas. The path toward the Inter-American Democratic Charter emerged from the lessons of anti-democratic experiences and movements in the last decades of the 20th century. By the 1990s, it had become clear that while a normative commitment to democracy existed in our hemisphere, the tools for systematic and collective response to threats required reinforcement and new hemispheric instruments. Likewise, the inter-American system needed to evolve from declaratory statements and commitments to practical mechanisms to strengthen both democracies and societies. That recognition found expression at the Third Summit of the Americas held in Quebec City in April 2011, where our heads of state and government affirmed that any unconstitutional interruption or alteration of the democratic order would constitute an insurmountable obstacle to participation in the summit process. They also instructed at that meeting in Quebec City the foreign ministers to prepare an Inter-American Democratic Charter to reinforce OAS instruments for the active defense of representative democracy. This decision sent a clear message to all those who may attempt to interrupt, disrupt, or even abort the constitutional order of a country. The community of American nations was united in collective action to uphold democratic institutions. That, within the OAS, remains our foremost responsibility and one of the reasons for our existence. The process culminated after committed and detailed dialogue and negotiations in Washington, D.C., and during the General Assembly in San Jose, Costa Rica, with the adoption of the Inter-American Democratic Charter in Lima on September 11, 2001. The Charter was born on a day of profound sorrow and uncertainty for the world. In that moment, when the global order seemed shaken, our region asserted that democracy itself is the strongest safeguard of stability and human dignity. That act of unity and conviction gave the Charter its enduring power. 24 years later, our world faces new challenges. That same unity and conviction must guide us still, as we reflect on how this instrument that our hemisphere drafted can remain dynamic and responsive to the challenges of our time. This notion raises then the important question: must we, in light of the 25th anniversary next year, embark on a process of review, of assessment, and, if agreed, suggest areas for improvement or strengthening of the Inter-American Democratic Charter? I leave this as an open question for the debate later in this conference. What must remain, though, constant in our commitment to the principles and collective action is our commitment to the principles and collective action as agreed before. In 2001, our ministers established a transformative vision that the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy and that their governments have an obligation to defend it and to govern democratically. With those words, our region transformed democracy from aspiration into entitlement, from an ideal to a practical delivery instrument for inclusivity, for equality, transparency, and accountability, towards peace and prosperity for all. The Charter then went further by defining what that right truly meant. It conceived democracy not only as the periodic holding of elections, but as a system for organizing our societies, one grounded in the respect for human rights, the separation of powers, transparency, and inclusion. As former Secretary General Cesar Gaviria explained, the Charter represented a political commitment to democracy, not in its minimalist electoral form, but as a broad and human-centered concept that embraces every dimension of dignity, peace, and prosperity. Building on this political commitment, the Inter-American Democratic Charter also endowed the hemisphere something that has been missing: concrete mechanisms to assist and, when necessary, defend democracy. In doing so, it translated words into action, giving the region and the Secretary General of the OAS the practical tools to respond collectively to threats and emerging challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, as we mark this anniversary, we can look back with pride on all what has been achieved, but we must also look ahead with purpose. The Charter was born out of consensus, out of a collective understanding that democracy is the only legitimate form of government in the Americas. That consensus was hard-won, and it must now be strengthened. This call is even more urgent today. Across our region, we witness growing polarization and a loss of trust in institutions and even in democracies that struggle to deliver peace, stability, and well-being. At the same time, multilateralism itself is being met with skepticism. Now, more than ever, we must return to the principles of the Charter. with the same conviction and courage that inspired its adoption. Building consensus is never easy, but it is possible when guided by shared values rather than ideology. We must reaffirm without hesitation that democracy is not negotiable. It is the foundation of peace, prosperity, and human dignity. It is the condition that allows us to resolve differences peacefully and to build societies in which every person has an opportunity to thrive. The Charter provides us with the tools to guide that effort, but that alone is, again, not enough. The future of democracy in our hemisphere depends on our ability to give life to those communities, to speak with one another rather than at one another, to listen with respect and to build together. This is precisely where the Charter's true strength lies, not in sanctions, but in proactive engagement and its capacity to foster dialogue, to prevent crises before they erupt, and to help restore legitimacy when it is lost. In that spirit, I'm not an advocate of negative agendas or repeated condemnations. That is not how consensus is built and becomes effective, not how stronger institutions emerge as well. We must, of course, speak clearly when principles are violated, but we must also engage in constructive dialogue, seek solutions and favor the convergence of efforts that strengthens democracy and stability in our hemisphere. That same spirit of dialogue must also guide us at home. The challenges we face today are simply too great to meet with dissolution or retreat. On the contrary, we must renew the social contract between citizens and their institutions. Democracy must adapt through transparency, inclusion, and genuine participation so that it continues to inspire trust, build ownership, and remain credible and resilient. A whole-of-society approach at the national and a whole-of-America's approach at the hemispheric level are critical, because we depend on each other for peace and prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, the peoples of the Americas have faced and overcome dark days. Yet they have chosen democracy not only because they cherish freedom, but because they recognize it in the past to a dignified life, a life in which their rights are protected and their basic needs are fulfilled. As a former foreign minister of Peru, Diego Garcia Sayan, noted, democracy by definition cannot admit exclusion. It finds its fullest meaning when it advances justice, transparency, and respect for diversity and gender equality. That is also why this promise of prosperity in our hemisphere is inseparable from the ability of our policy to deliver tangible benefits for all. While the inter-American system has rightly placed great emphasis on democracy and human rights, Article 11 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter reminds us that democracy and social and economic development are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Because for our people, the value of democracy is measured not only at the ballot box, but in daily lives, in opportunity, in fairness, and in confidence that public institutions serve the common good. Poverty and inequality weaken the fabric of democracy just as much as the erosion of checks and balances does. A democracy that delivers, by contrast, builds resilience. When people see that their voices lead to fairer outcomes, they become less vulnerable to skepticism and less tempted by authoritarian shortcuts to complex problems. Delivering results is therefore as essential to development as it is to democracy. In this sense, building prosperity in the Western Hemisphere strengthens democracy itself. The Organization of American States remains the region's principal platform for defending and promoting democracy. Through its provision on electoral observation missions, the Inter-American Democratic Charter has enabled the Organization of American States to strengthen the practice of sending independent missions for free and fair elections. At the same time, through our work on the ground in areas such as sustainable development and security, we give life to the Charter's conviction that democratic governance cannot be separated from social and economic rights. In doing so, our organization continues to embody the spirit of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, translating its vision into action across the Americas. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that democracy will never be perfect. Yet it remains the only system that allows us to correct our mistakes in freedom rather than in fear. The Inter-American Democratic Charter embodies that same spirit. It is a normative compass reminding us that democracy's strength lies in its capacity for renewal. It has guided the region's response to challenges and helped frame how democracy must be renewed rather than taken for granted. As this landmark instrument approaches its 25th anniversary, we are called not only to celebrate its legacy, but also to reflect on how it can continue to respond to the evolving realities of our time. That reflection also requires a deeper conversation about what democracy means for people. Such an ongoing task of renewal does not belong to governments and politicians alone. It belongs to the society as a whole. Democracy's vitality depends on the active participation of all, the civil society, the private sector, academia, and youth. Their engagement gives true force to the Inter-American Democratic Charter, for its principles are only as strong as the people who uphold them. The Charter's promise will only be fulfilled when each one of us accepts responsibility for building a future that is peaceful and prosperous, and when we recognize and accept the value of hemispheric cooperation and hemispheric multilateralism. The Organization of American States, in my humble view, is the best suited to fulfill this role. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I now invite His Excellency Ambassador Tomas Ignacio Pascual, Chair of the Permanent Council and Permanent Representative of Chile to the OAS, to take the floor.
Muy buenos días a todas las autoridades presentes. Hago míos los vocativos y saludos del secretario general, en especial a nuestros colegas representantes permanentes que están acá, y por cierto también una felicitación a la Secretaría del Fortalecimiento de las Democracias por la organización de esta actividad que no puede venir en un mejor momento. No pretendo teorizar sobre la democracia cuando tengo, a mi lado, literalmente, a un premio Nobel y expertos y expertas que tendrán la oportunidad de exponer el día de hoy. De modo que estas palabras de inicio tienen el objeto de provocar, a partir de lo que vemos y escuchamos como estados en nuestro diario vivir, y que quienes creemos firmemente en la democracia nos tienen en estado de alerta. La descripción de uno de los pilares que sostienen el trabajo de esta organización refiere que la democracia es la piedra angular de la paz, la seguridad y el desarrollo en el hemisferio. Pues bien, la primera pregunta que surge es si existe consenso hoy día, después de 24 años de adoptada la Carta Interamericana y del azote de las dictaduras en nuestro hemisferio, sobre un tipo de democracia en la actualidad. Es común oír en distintos foros que no se puede imponer un modelo de democracia y que éste debe atender a la realidad y tradición de cada pueblo. En segundo término, debemos preguntarnos también si existe una correlación entre democracia y prosperidad, en contextos donde pareciera resistirse la idea de que la deliberación pública en manos de nuestros representantes y los procedimientos de participación ciudadana afectan esa promesa de promoverla. Sobre esto último me gustaría proveer un ejemplo propio de nuestra región, con economías en desarrollo y esencialmente exportadoras de materias primas. Es común enfrentarse al dilema de que la democracia y sus instituciones promueven una regulación exigente, así como una activa participación ciudadana, incluida la consulta indígena, que terminan afectando la viabilidad de proyectos de inversión. La tesis, tras esto, y que no es nueva, es que en un diseño institucional que nos ha legado las democracias que buscan un desarrollo sostenible en países en desarrollo, suele terminar espantando la prosperidad. Los inversores se ven inhibidos porque sus proyectos deben enfrentar muchas barreras y en algunos casos el menosprecio de la ciudadanía organizada. Alguien podría decir que este no es un problema de la democracia, sino que de un diseño regulatorio. Pero lo cierto es que cuando han sido los modelos democráticos los que han abierto espacio a una regulación más exigente y a una participación ciudadana activa, suelen confundirse ambos planos, y la tentación de reducir ambos aparece con fuerza. En consecuencia, lo que empieza a emerger es que para esa anhelada prosperidad sería deseable menos deliberación y por consiguiente un mayor grado de discrecionalidad por parte de la autoridad que viabilice, por ejemplo, este tipo de proyectos de inversión. Allí tenemos un problema, porque la tesis propuesta por algunos pareciera ser que para mayor prosperidad es necesario disminuir las exigencias democráticas. Por esto mismo, la conferencia del doctor Acemoglu y quienes lo sucederán en las palabras viene en un momento de mucha relevancia para atender esta y otras interrogantes que surgen con fuerza en el escenario actual y que el secretario general ha referido como parte de los desafíos que suceden hoy a 24 años de la adopción de la Carta Interamericana, donde pareciera estar de moda el repliegue democrático, con la promesa de una mayor prosperidad que excede con mucho a lo meramente económico y que constituye una amenaza a las instituciones y al Estado de Derecho. Que este espacio, amigos y amigas, nos sirva de reflexión para comprender los desafíos que enfrentamos en el hemisferio y a nivel global, sobre todo desde este lugar pionero en la promoción de la democracia para alcanzar la prosperidad de nuestros pueblos. Bienvenidos a todos, bienvenido al doctor Acemoglu y que tengamos una muy buena conferencia. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Embajador. It is now my pleasure to invite Minister Adrian Howry, Chargé d'Affaires ad interim of the Embassy of Switzerland to the United States, to offer his remarks.
Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, excellencies, colleagues, it's a great honor to take part in the opening of today's dialogue organized in partnership by the Organization of American States and International IDEA. As the title of today's event suggests, we are here to reflect on the promise of democracy and prosperity for the Western Hemisphere. And indeed, democracy holds the promise of prosperity. We are very privileged to soon hear from one of the foremost experts on this topic, Nobel Prize laureate Professor Daron Acemoglu, and thank you very much for being here. Yet democracy is more than just a promise of prosperity. Democracy is hard work. It should never be taken for granted. Every day we must protect civic space, uphold checks and balances, and ensure that governments remain accountable to their citizens. This is hard work, and we have to do it in our daily lives. Above all, we must nurture the trust of people in their public institutions. Some say democracy is supposed to be a party, and today's event also marks two key celebratory and historic milestones. First, the 24th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, a landmark document, as the Secretary General just mentioned, reaffirming the region's collective commitment to democracy. And second, the 30th anniversary of International IDEA, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Switzerland is proud to serve as the current chair of IDEA's Council of Member States, alongside the vice chairs Indonesia and the Dominican Republic. Both the OIS and International IDEA share a long-standing dedication to the promotion of democracy. The OIS Charter, since 1948, has recognized democracy as indispensable to development, and just like the OIS Charter, the Swiss constitution mandates the promotion of democracy, recognizing its importance for development. Switzerland's own experience shows that democracy is not limited to elections. It flourishes through inclusive dialogue, citizen participation, respect for diversity, consensus, the protection of minorities, and strong local ownership. For Switzerland, democracy is both a core national value, but also a pillar of our foreign policy. Earlier this year, we adopted our first ever democracy guidelines, translating this commitment into practice. These guidelines serve as a compass for our global efforts, reminding us that democracy is not only a value to uphold, but also key in the path towards peace, towards prosperity and innovation. Of course, democracy cannot be strengthened by governments alone. It requires the collective engagement of civil society, of academia, philanthropy, and the private sector. But it also demands courage. Courage to defend democratic principles, especially when they are challenged. Democracy, as we know, is never complete and is never guaranteed. It requires constant care, renewal, and innovation. We draw inspiration and are encouraged by the democratic innovation across Latin America and the Caribbean, from participatory budgeting and indigenous representation to citizen-led accountability initiatives. These examples remind us that democracy, the renewal begins within societies when people are empowered to shape their own futures. So what does democracy promise? Prosperity, certainly, but also sometimes painful work, participation, progress, and peace. I look forward to today's discussion and continuous partnership with the OAS, international IDEA, as well as many of the OAS member states as we work together to advance an inclusive and resilient and prosperous democratic future for this hemisphere and beyond. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Howry. To continue, we are pleased to share a pre-recorded message from Senator Ivan Flores, President of Parliamericas, who joins us virtually for this commemorative event.
Excelentísimo señor Albert Randem, secretario general de la Organización de los Estados Americanos. Excelentísimo embajador Tomás Ignacio Pascual, presidente del Consejo Permanente y representante permanente de Chile ante la Organización de los Estados Americanos. Excelentísimo ministro Adrián Howry, jefe adjunto de la misión de la Embajada Suiza a los Estados Unidos. Excelentísimas embajadoras y embajadores, señoras y señores. Es un verdadero honor dirigirme a ustedes en nombre de Parlaméricas, la organización parlamentaria del sistema interamericano creada por resolución de la OEA y que representa a los parlamentos de los 35 países de las 4 Américas sin exclusiones. A casi un cuarto de siglo de su adopción, en cada uno de sus 28 artículos, la Carta Interamericana nos recuerda un imperativo que trasciende el tiempo y las angustias transitorias. Nos señala la Carta que solo la democracia puede ser la base sobre la cual se edifica la prosperidad y el bienestar de nuestros pueblos, así como la obligación de los gobiernos por promoverla y defenderla. Esto como principio fundante de la convivencia y el irrestricto respeto de los derechos fundamentales. Hoy observamos con preocupación algunas semillas de maldad y brotes inaceptables de autoritarismo que no se pueden soslayar. Solo allí donde florece la democracia reverdece el desarrollo en su concepto amplio y con letra grande. Y cuando la paz social se apoya en la justicia y la igualdad de oportunidades para una vida digna y segura, donde nadie se queda afuera ni nadie se queda atrás, sin hambre y sin miedo, solo allí la prosperidad puede echar raíces fuertes, firmes y duraderas. La certeza compartida de que el destino democrático del hemisferio y su prosperidad están indisolublemente unidos es también la esencia misma del sistema interamericano, y eso hay que protegerlo a toda costa. Para los parlamentos de las 4 Américas, esta convicción adquiere una expresión concreta porque somos los encargados de dar vida a los principios de la Carta Democrática, traduciendo su visión en un esfuerzo y un compromiso común de unirnos en torno a la justicia, la libertad y la igualdad. Y como si aún estuviésemos a fines del siglo XVIII, donde el grito de la justice, liberté, égalité y fraternité nos llama y nos apremia por mejores logros y mayores esfuerzos. Hoy, a la luz de un contexto global y hemisférico marcado por retrocesos democráticos, por tensiones geopolíticas, por el deterioro de la seguridad ciudadana y la persistencia de profundas desigualdades sociales, los parlamentos estamos llamados a ocupar un lugar central en la preservación del pacto democrático, como espacio donde se forja la voluntad colectiva y se renueva la confianza de que la política, pero la buena y honesta política, es el instrumento para alcanzar el bien común. En este momento decisivo para nuestras democracias, la Carta Democrática Interamericana sigue vigente y nos convoca a renovar la promesa que la inspiró. Nuestra Parlaméricas, como expresión del compromiso democrático permanente y vivo de los parlamentos del hemisferio, reafirma hoy nuevamente su determinación de seguir trabajando junto a la OEA y a las instituciones del sistema interamericano para hacer de la democracia el camino más cierto y seguro hacia un futuro más promisorio y próspero para nuestra gente. Estimadas y estimados amigos, en esta coyuntura crítica que duele, debemos reafirmar la vigencia de la Carta no como un acto ceremonial ni declaratorio, sino como un imperativo ético y político para salvaguardar la estabilidad, la libertad y paz social en las Américas y el Caribe. Tengan buen día. Muchas gracias.
We now turn to our keynote session, featuring one of the world's most distinguished thinkers on political economy and institutions, Professor Daron Acemoglu, Institute Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and recipient of the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. I invite Professor Acemoglu and Gerardo de Icaza, Director of the Department of Electoral Cooperation and Observation of the OAS, to take the stage. Before the session begins, a brief reminder: when you arrived, you were handed note cards. These are for submitting questions in writing for both the keynote session and the later panel discussion. If you have a question, please write it down and hand it to one of the room attendants that you will see, and they will hand them to the moderator. Pens are also available on tables if you need them. This session will consist of a 25-minute keynote presentation, followed by a 15-minute moderated dialogue. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to Gerardo de Icaza, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Malene. Happy Halloween, everyone. All protocol observed. It is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome the 2024 Nobel Laureate in Economics, Professor Daron Acemoglu, professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and one of the most influential economists of our time. I am completely aware that you are here to listen to Professor Acemoglu and not to me, so I will be brief. It is important, however, to recognize how his work connects to the mission of the Organization of American States as we continue advancing democracy, sustainable development, and human rights across our region. Professor Acemoglu's pioneering research has transformed our understanding of how institutions, governance, and technological change shape the prosperity and inclusion of nations, from why nations fail to the narrow corridor. His insights explain why some societies achieve lasting progress while others struggle with inequality and weak institutions. These lessons resonate strongly in the Americas, where we face persistent inequality, gaps in digital access and education, and the rapid transformation of labor markets driven by new technology. His work reminds us that economic progress depends not only on growth, but on the strength of our institutions and inclusiveness of our choices. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Darren Osamulu to the House of the Americas.
Thank you very much, Gerardo, and thank you, Secretary General. Thank you, Ambassador Rique, and thank you, everybody, for the very nice introduction. It's my distinct pleasure to be here. I think it's a very meaningful occasion. It's the 24th anniversary of the Inter-American Democracy Charter, so I'm going to talk about democracy. Latin America has been, or the Americas more generally, have been a lab for understanding the evolution of institutions and their effects. So it's great to have an opportunity. I will do the crazy thing of actually telling you snippets of the main messages from 4 of my books, Why Nations Fail, The Narrow Corridor, Power and Progress, and my new book on what happened to liberal democracy, which will come out in August. And it's also meaningful that this is Halloween. You know, there are some scary things about the history of democracy, some failures, but All Souls Day is tomorrow, all sins are forgotten. So I think we can forge ahead. So my research has very largely focused on institutions, in particular in a series of papers and then in Why Nations Fail. The main message that I try to convey with my co-authors, James Robinson, and sometimes with Simon Johnson, has been about the role of inclusive institutions. Inclusive institutions meaning, at the economic level, those that secure property rights, that provide a level playing field, that provide regulations against monopoly and excessive economic power, including inequality when it becomes stifling. And at the political level, inclusive political institutions, meaning those that constrain arbitrary power and provide pathways for individuals to participate in politics, such as democratic politics of the electoral form that we have come to accept in many parts of the world, and more generally provide pathways for individuals' voices to be heard, and also more generally for the state to function in a way that's consistent with the wishes and desires of citizens, so responsiveness of the state. A lot of the roots of institutions go back in history, and that's why the history of the Americas is so relevant. For example, as I have argued in my research with Simon Johnson and James Robinson, you know, you cannot understand institutions in the Americas without looking at the colonization experience. In 1500, before the colonization experience started, according to several measures, Mexico or Peru, or areas that are now Mexico and Peru, for example, were quite a lot more developed economically, politically, socially than, say, in the northeast of the United States, which was much more sparsely settled, had no urbanization, had no industry, had no organized agriculture, and so on. But then, look at it in 300 years' times then, in the 1800s, you see a reversal. Northeast of the United States is much more dynamic. Industrialization has started. Income per capita is increasing. Urbanization is going up rapidly. This isn't about geography. It isn't about culture. A lot of the historical and statistical work that we have done strongly supports the idea that it is about institutions. Europeans brought very different institutions in different parts of their colonial empire. In some places, such as most of Latin America, institutions were taken over from existing civilizations or introduced afresh for being able to dominate existing populations, extract resources, be able to control labor, and set up hierarchical systems with Europeans themselves or their representatives at the top. These were the basis of the extractive institutions that contrast with political institutions, and it was an ensemble of both economic institutions, things like the encomienda, the mita, repartimiento, and political institutions that concentrated political power without any responsiveness to the wishes of the people, especially the indigenous populations. In other places where Europeans did not encounter as much to take over, large populations to put to work, such as northeastern United States, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, that option wasn't open to them. It's not that European colonizers didn't try, they did. Often they brought in indentured servants from Europe and tried to put them to work in the same way that they successfully did with the native populations, but that didn't work with the open frontier. There's very sparsely settled populations, and people who were of European descent had greater capability to rebel and not be completely slaughtered. And as a result, their initial plans failed, and de facto, they were put on a path to more inclusive institutions. And a lot of these institutional heritage is very long-lasting. So you see the effects of these institutions in 1800, industrialization, how agriculture was organized, how states were organized. You see it in 1900, you see it in 1950, you see it in 2000. So a natural question that people ask is whether today's political and institutional choices matter, such as democracy. Perhaps they don't matter. Perhaps democracy is just a facade. Well, that, fortunately, isn't so, and that's another branch of my work where I have looked at both the origins of democracy and the economic consequences of democracy. With China's rise, lots of economic and political problems in the West, we have good reason to question the track record of democracy, and I'll talk more about that in the context of my new book. And many people have either jumped to the conclusion that democracy is gridlocked and not appropriate for the challenges that we're facing today, including AI, about which I'm going to talk a little bit as well, or they have looked at data, for example, comparing economic performance between some democratic and non-democratic countries, and have expressed doubts about the success of democracy. My research, and some of this has also featured in my books, but especially in my research, I have tried to shed doubt on these approaches. They either generalize from examples that don't merit generalization or end up comparing apples and oranges. If you actually look at the data in a more systematic way, I have found that democracy does quite well, thank you. So countries that democratize, relative to their counterfactual growth that they would have experienced if they had remained non-democratic, for example, as proxied by what other non-democratic countries with similar characteristics have done during similar periods, grow quite rapidly after democratization. In about 20 years' time, countries that democratize are about 20% richer in terms of GDP per capita. Moreover, that comes in a way that I think is quite desirable from a social perspective. Higher education, better health, better services for the lower strata of society. Also higher tax revenues, by the way. One of the things that democracies do is they increase taxes. So if you're really anti-tax, you might think that's a bad thing, but actually when you think about many of the countries that are at the cusp of democratizing, they often have weak states and weak budgets like many in Latin America, so increasing tax revenues and doing that with some legitimacy is actually quite a good achievement. And that is what enables better health, better education, and so on. This result is very robust. Democracies do have problems. There are some autocracies that sometimes grow, but regardless of what continent you look at, regardless of what income level you look at, democracies do better. So in light of this, you might think democracy should be hugely popular. Everybody should love democracy and we should see a big march towards democracy. Reality isn't completely the opposite, but is much more complex. A period that is loosely referred to as the third wave by the political scientist Samuel Huntington that started with the collapse of Southern European dictatorships in Portugal, Greece, and Spain, heralded the beginning of many other countries democratizing, especially in Latin America, some in Asia and Africa as well. And I think that period that went from the 1970s, mid-1970s to 2000s was the background to the 24th, to the Inter-American Democracy Charter. The third wave was characterized not just by a movement towards democracy, but a popular wish for democratic institutions. Everywhere from Lima to Santiago to Krakow to Delhi, people wanted democracy because they thought that would mean voice and they wanted to participate in politics. And they also thought, just like the statistical results that I mentioned indicate, that democracy would be better for them. For example, for workers in Brazil during the democratization process when they organized in trade unions, it was a very important aspect of the industrial relations that democracy should come so that their demands would be better met. Same thing in Poland, same thing in the Czech Republic, and so on. But today, the situation looks very different. As the Secretary General and Ambassador Rike have also hinted at, democracy is in a bit of a crisis right now. If you ask people, especially the young, what they think of democracy, it's much more negative today than it was 30 years ago. And this is particularly pronounced in the United States, the United Kingdom, okay, that's not part of OAS, and many Latin American countries. So we are, again, at the epicenter of something very discombobulating, but also interesting. Why is it that democracy is in crisis? And it's not just perceptions. According to data from Freedom House and other international organizations that track democracy, we see that many democracies are getting weaker, less democratic, and many more countries are transitioning from democracy to authoritarian governments than the other way around. Complete reversal of the third wave. In fact, according to the Freedom House, the last 17 years have seen a steady decline in democracy around the world. This is the topic of my new book, What Happened to Liberal Democracy. A lot of my focus is on the US because it is where arguably you see these forces most clearly, and it is the center of gravity of political dynamics for much of the world. But the same things apply to Western Europe and apply to Latin America. First of all, we have challenges to democracy from strongmen. That's not new. It's always been the case. But the nature of these challenges has changed. If you look at the 1980s, if I ask you who was more dangerous for democracy, you would think of generals in jackboots. They were the ones that were engineering coups, sometimes representing other interests. Today, military coups are a rarity pretty much everywhere around the world, with the exception of a few pockets in Africa. The strongmen are often elected, from the Philippines to Budapest, Hungary, from Turkey to Latin America to the United States. It is people who challenge democracy with authoritarian changes in norms and institutions from the inside. Perhaps those threats are more effective, more dangerous, possible. But I think there is something deeper. The deeper thing is that democracy has failed in some respects. And I want to be very clear what I'm saying here. When I say democracy has failed, I do not mean that authoritarian governments would have done better or could have done better. I've started by saying democracy has a very robust track record of doing better than authoritarian governments. Nevertheless, democracy has failed because it hasn't lived up to the promises it made, to the expectations and aspirations it raised. By and large, in what I already described, implicit were three promises that democracy, liberal democracy, made, and in fact delivered for a while. Shared prosperity, meaning that as economic growth took place, every segment of society would get some benefits from that. Public services. Democratization often happens in a background of elitist or sometimes conservative or sometimes failing governments that do not prioritize health, education, roads for large numbers of people in their country. So there is a hunger for these kinds of services, and democracy comes to power, and time after time you see that democratic governments do a renewed effort to build roads, to invest in the healthcare of the less fortunate, less wealthy segments of society, invest in education, and so on. And oftentimes that works, sometimes it has problems. And democracy delivers shared prosperity. In the United States, in Europe, in Canada, and to some parts of Latin America, consolidated democracies delivered very rapid and remarkably shared economic growth. So for example, in the United States, from around the middle of the 1940s, right after World War II, to the late 1970s, real wages grew, inflation-adjusted wages grew by almost 2.5% a year, remarkable. And this wage growth was faster than the rate of profit growth, and it was very equally distributed. College-educated workers did not experience faster growth than those without a high school degree or with just a high school degree. And democracy promised voice. That's its foundational promise, that people do participate in politics, policies are responsive to their desire, and they feel like they are being listened to. Again, for a while, across the world, democracies did achieve some of that. But over the last 4 decades, we see a very different track record of democracy. Inequality has skyrocketed in the United States. For example, the picture from the 1980s onwards stands in stark contrast to what I described for the earlier period. Real wages grew for people with postgraduate degrees, with some subsets of those which have a college degree, but they actually declined for men without a high school degree or with just a high school degree. Inequality increased across the world, including in Latin America. Shared prosperity fell by the wayside. Public services became more unequally distributed and much more inefficient due to the difficulties of dealing with education and health in a complex society, regulatory problems, and difficulties of overcoming some organized groups such as the health insurance and pharmaceutical companies in the United States. And there were many cracks in the edifice of democratic voice. From Latin America to Europe, from Europe to United States, the refrain that politicians don't listen to us, to people like us, and our views are being suppressed, increased. In the United States and in Europe, particularly important were issues of immigration and other cultural changes, but it wasn't confined to that. Economic policies started diverging quite significantly, especially as the center-left parties became more education-heavy and much more catering and being run by very highly educated cadres. There was a bigger divergence between the wishes of the working classes and the policies of center-left parties, making democracies much less responsive, or at least appear much less responsive. So in some sense, the crisis of liberal democracy, both in terms of the retrenchment of liberal democracy and people's views that liberal democracy is not functioning, that they don't trust institutions, they don't trust the judiciary, they don't trust the parliaments. That has some real roots. And that is the reason why there is such an opening for strongmen and people who are challenging democratic norms. But democracy remains and will remain the most conducive system for building shared prosperity, building consensus, dealing with very vexing problems such as AI, climate change, demographic change, which are being experienced by all countries, especially in the Americas. And the lessons here are no different than what James Robinson and I try to talk about in the narrow corridor. And as Minister Adrian Horry mentioned, the key is that democracy is a process. So the main idea of the narrow corridor is that you don't create democratic institutions from above or even from below just at once. It is a process whereby bottom-up participation and the strengthening of institutions, including the state's ability to penetrate society, evolve at the same time, and they have to co-evolve in a balanced manner. And trust in institutions is key. And where does that trust come from? Well, that trust comes from many places. Institutions having a track record that is trustworthy, but also shared prosperity. My research over the last few years, for example, documents that people's support for democracy is much stronger when democracy delivers in terms of shared prosperity, in terms of public good, in terms of controlling corruption, in terms of controlling instability. In Latin America, there are other sources of evidence that show very clearly how corruption episodes strongly disfavor democratic institutions, and incumbents and voters turn against politicians very quickly. So people expect something from democracy, and when they don't get it, they become rightly frustrated. So if democracy, along the lines of the narrow corridor, is going to have this evolution towards both greater state strength so that we can deliver the resources and the services that society needs, and strong societies that can have their voices heard, civil society participation, democratic participation, ways of controlling corruption, ways of having your voices heard, all of these is a process. Latin America, in this context, has suffered from what James Robinson and I have called paper leviathans. States that look strong but are actually unable to really penetrate society. That's why across the Latin Americas you see several states in which tax revenues are like 15% of GDP. An amazingly low number. But Latin American populations want the kinds of services that people in Western Europe want. You cannot do that with 15% tax revenue. But you're stuck with 15% tax revenue because these states are weak. Why are states weak? Well, states are going to remain weak if people don't trust the states. And they're right not to trust the states. States need to deliver in terms of, so there's a bit of a catch-22 there. But it is a process that has happened before, and it can happen again. And trusting democratic institutions and prioritizing shared prosperity is key. But I want to end my comments by pointing out that actually the challenges are even deeper than my previous 20 minutes of comments may suggest. We are actually at the cusp of truly destabilizing changes. Each one of them would be epochal. Demographic change, countries aging very rapidly. In Latin America, which has remained for the last 200 years a very young continent, suddenly we're going to see much, much more aged populations, much more gray than before, and in an unexpected way, and in a way that politicians are not prepared for it. Climate change, and I don't just mean the energy transition, but a changing climate, especially in South America, is going to necessitate complete redesigns of urban centers, how services are produced and delivered, big changes. But most importantly, AI. Artificial intelligence is there, and pretty much nowhere in the developing world is ready for it. The United States is not ready for it. China is not ready for it. But at least United States and China, even though they're not using it right now, have agency. Much of research on AI is being done in these countries, and as a result, there is a big digital infrastructure in those countries. Latin America, for example, has neither. There is still a big shortage of proper digital infrastructure and education. And nobody's asking the opinions of people from South America about which direction of AI should go. So, for the next decade or beyond, if we are on this path, artificial intelligence will remain something done to the developing world, something in which they have very little agency. But that's a problem because the kind of AI that every country needs is somewhat different. It depends not just on your language, but it depends on what are the comparative advantages, what are the skills of your workforce, what are the industries in which you want to create good jobs for your workforce. In much of South America, still there's a problem of big informality, which is a problem of creating good jobs. That's going to get much worse with AI technology spreading around. So it is imperative, but actually also for workers in Western Europe and the United States, that AI goes in what I have called a pro-worker direction, a direction where it augments and amplifies workers' skills and becomes a vehicle for creating good jobs, not just automating work. But that's not the direction in which we're going. And I think a very important part of going in that direction is having more voice from the developing world. And nobody's going to listen to an individual country. They're not going to listen to Turkey. They're not going to listen to Indonesia. They're not going to listen to Mexico or Brazil or Chile. But if there was a more concerted voice, and perhaps OAS as well as other international organizations can play some of that role, then it becomes more likely that the coherent voice from the developing world will have more impact. But that's not all. There's another directional choice. It's not just in the domain of automation versus pro-worker, but it's also how do we use AI when it comes to communication. And there too I have bad news, because the default position seems to be one in which AI is used more and more for surveillance, for suppressing dissent, for centralizing information in the hands of powerful organizations, sometimes different from states, sometimes they're working in cahoots with states, and that's not good for dissent, that's not good for democratic participation, that's not good for diversity of opinion, it's not good for opposition to strongmen and authoritarian governments. So I think there's a double whammy for democracy coming everywhere, and politicians and civil society organizations are very ill prepared for it. So we do need the Inter-American Democracy Charter. We do need it more than ever, but we also have to be realistic. We need to really redouble, triple-double our efforts to defend democracy. It still remains the only game in town. If you want voice, if you want shared prosperity, if you want an environment in which human autonomy and human dignity are respected. But the next decade for democracy will be rocky. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, so much. It has been a treat. It's not a Halloween joke. But now there's a trick that I have a lot of questions.
Great.
And I need to concentrate them into certain issues. So,
and into 10 minutes, yes, I know.
Into
your
10
job
minutes,
is hard.
so it's a challenge. So one of the recurring questions that we got from the audience is, you spoke about how certain minorities or certain populations have been more affected than others, indigenous in the early centuries, but then how Latin America is getting older, and there will be concerns with the age gaps. But how has these developments and looking forward with the gender issues, especially with towards inclusion of women in labor force, and perhaps talk a little bit about AI and equality. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, obviously, inclusion of women is a major issue. Most societies around the world were patriarchal for the last, 2,000 years or more. But if you believe, like I do, and that was the subtext of my argument that AI shouldn't just go in a direction of eliminating human input or automating work, human resources, human ingenuity, human skills are still critical. And if you have a country that, say, like Saudi Arabia, that completely excludes women, what it's doing is that it's taking half of its most valuable resource and it's throwing it away. Now, Latin American countries are not there. They're only throwing away 30% of it. But I think there's much more inclusion that will be useful, not just for women, I think for society as a whole. But the experience from other countries also shows cultural change cannot be done from top down. When it takes the form of social engineering and imposition, it creates backlash. And many Latin American countries have also, conservative cultures in certain domains, so it has to be navigated just the right way. The direction has to remain towards greater inclusion, but the way that this happens has to be felt as a more bottom-up process, not top-down.
Professor, and I lead the elections team here at the OAS, and I'm using and abusing my power as a moderator to get an elections question in here. How do we combine the creation of strong institutions, that is a long-term project, with these short electoral cycles, where the tendency is perhaps to go away with the old and come in with the new?
That's a problem. I think it's a problem Latin America has suffered from. It's even a more problem with the rise of authoritarian leaders, because what authoritarian leaders do is that they destroy the institutional fabric and norms that create fairness in the marketplace. It creates an environment for innovation. It creates security. And many of these changes actually don't have immediate effects. Their effects are often felt in 5-10 years' time. So you're going to have more and more this situation where in country after country, authoritarian leaders come to power, they destroy institutions, and the bill is then paid by the next president or next prime minister. So it is a problem. But here is what democracy means. Democracy doesn't just mean that every 4 years we go to the polls. Democracy means a process of political participation. More broadly, civil society participation. And that's what, for example, we emphasized in the narrow corridor. And I think if you have that richer conception of democracy, you're a little more insured against this. Not completely, but you're a little. So I think in many Latin American countries and in many other countries in the developing world, what you have seen is there's an acceptance of the electoral process. And there is episodic participation, for example, through protests, etc. But the more constructive civil society participation that is even and effective hasn't fully developed. And that's one place where perhaps more progress can be made.
Professor, in his opening remarks, Secretary General spoke about the criticism that multilateralism is receiving today. If you had a magic wand and you could say, the OAS or the African Union or the EU, the Council of Europe, need to have 4 or 5 resolutions on these serious topics for the next year or 2 years, what would they be?
Well, look, I think let's go back one step. The problems that the world faces that I described as epochal are all global. AI is global. The increasing power of multinational corporations that are able to skirt regulations, not pay taxes, that's a global problem. Climate change is global, demographic change is global. Pandemics are global, nuclear non-proliferation is global. So we need global governance. But our international organizations are all weak. We saw with the WHO, for example, during the COVID pandemic. We're seeing with the United Nations today, with Ukraine or with Israel-Palestine, international organizations are often weak. And there's a good reason for that. Politics is local. Politics emanates from the local on to the national level, And we haven't found a way of that transition from the national to the international. I don't think it's going to be easy. So we have to experiment. And the big success there is the European Union. It has many faults. It's committed some blunders. But the European Union remains a very important supranational institution. I think we need more of those. OAS, the African Union, I think they have to play more of that role. And I think in all of the areas that I mentioned, they need to articulate an umbrella position that reflects the broad interests of the developing world. Artificial intelligence, demographic change, multinational organizations. I think those are key. And of course, statements. They can only get you so far. But I think we have to start somewhere.
Thank you so much, Professor. Would you do us the great honor of signing some books
Of course,
outside?
I would be delighted.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd also like to finish by just giving a shout out to the DECO team, and especially Yeruti Mendez back there. And thank you for the Secretary General for allowing us to have these types of conversations. I think they're very useful, and for the Secretary Krajewicz as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fabio. Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Professor Acemoglu and Director De Casa, for such an inspiring exchange. Perhaps we can have another round of applause for them. Before we move on, just one more brief announcement. As Gerardo said, if you brought a book authored by Professor Acemoglu, there's a table just outside where he will sign them for you. We will now take a 15-minute break. Please enjoy the refreshments we have for you. And if you could be back at 45, that will allow us to continue our program. Thank you.
On September 11, 2001, in Lima, Peru, the OAS General Assembly adopted with the unanimous vote of its member states the Inter-American Democratic Charter. This resolution was the result of a request that the Summit of the Americas, meeting in April of that year in Quebec, made to the regional organization. This charter is the final link in a pioneering development of the Inter-American system since the adoption in Bogota in 1948 of the charter by which the Organization of American States was established. The context surrounding its adoption was very different from that of previous decades.
The decade of the 90s was unique for the hemisphere. In South America, military regimes realized that modern societies were too complicated to be ruled with bayonets. In Central America, the Cold War, the proxy war between the United States and the Soviet bloc had worn itself out, and there was a sense that the only solution was not military, but political and democratic.
The Democratic Charter took advantage of this moment to define that representative democracy is the sum of many elements that comprise it. It lists the essential ones among them: respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, access to power and its exercise subject to the rule of law, the holding of free, periodic, and fair elections, the pluralistic system of political parties and organizations, and the separation and independence of the branches of government. But that was not enough.
En muchos de los países de América del Sur, los países de América Central también estaban terminando largos periodos dictatoriales, generalmente terminados además en conflictos y guerras civiles muy dolorosas. Entonces, el primer trabajo en el marco de la OEA es: no queremos más los golpes militares. Ese fue el primer entorno, y sobre eso hubo un consenso a principios de los 90. Pero luego se fueron produciendo estas nuevas modalidades de alteración, y ahí se genera un nuevo consenso en la región. Tampoco queremos estas nuevas modalidades de alteración del orden constitucional.
These new modalities had a specific form. Legitimately elected governments were the ones that subverted democracy. Thus, the Charter contemplated mechanisms to face the case of a threat, a serious alteration or even rupture of the democratic order. At the very moment the Charter was being approved in Lima, the world was convulsed by the attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. The next day, the world would no longer be the same. Thanks to the Charter, neither would the way the Americas protected democracy. The member states of the OAS had provided solid grounds to defend it together.
Los fundamentales son el compromiso por parte de todos los estados americanos de aceptar estas modalidades por las cuales otros estados pueden actuar para promover y inclusive la Secretaría General, para promover y consolidar la democracia en un estado. Esto ha sido absolutamente pionero. Recién ahora, otros sistemas regionales están incorporando normas similares.
El 11 de septiembre de 2001, la Asamblea General de la OEA adoptó en Lima, por unanimidad de todos sus Estados miembros, la Carta Democrática Interamericana. Esta resolución fue resultado de una solicitud que la Cumbre de las Américas, reunida en abril de ese año en Quebec, le hiciera a la organización regional. Esta carta es el último eslabón de un desarrollo pionero del sistema interamericano desde la adopción en Bogotá en 1948 de la carta por la que se constituyó la Organización de los Estados Americanos, OEA. El contexto era muy diferente del de décadas anteriores.
The decade of the 90s was unique for the hemisphere. In South America, military regimes realized that modern societies were too complicated to be ruled with bayonets. In Central America, the Cold War, the proxy war between the United States and the Soviet bloc had worn itself out, and there was a sense that the only solution was not military, but political and democratic.
La Carta Democrática aprovecha ese momento para definir que la democracia representativa es la suma de muchos elementos que la integran y enumera los esenciales, entre ellos el respeto a los derechos humanos y las libertades fundamentales, el acceso al poder y su ejercicio con sujeción al Estado de Derecho, la celebración de elecciones libres, periódicas y transparentes, el régimen plural de partidos y organizaciones políticas y la separación e independencia de los poderes públicos. Pero ello no bastaba.
En muchos de los países de América del Sur, los países de América Central también estaban terminando largos periodos dictatoriales, generalmente terminados además en conflictos, guerras civiles muy dolorosas. Entonces, el primer trabajo en el marco de la OEA es no queremos más los golpes militares. Ese fue el primer entorno y sobre eso hubo un consenso a principios de los 90. Pero luego se fueron produciendo estas nuevas modalidades de alteración y ahí se genera un nuevo consenso en la región. Tampoco queremos estas nuevas modalidades de alteración del orden constitucional.
Esas nuevas modalidades tenían una forma específica. Gobiernos legítimamente electos eran los que subvertían la democracia. Así, la Carta contempló mecanismos para afrontar el caso de una amenaza, una alteración grave o incluso una ruptura del orden democrático. En los mismos instantes en que en Lima se aprobaba la Carta, el mundo se convulsionaba por los atentados en Nueva York y Washington. Al día siguiente, el mundo ya no sería igual. Gracias a la Carta, tampoco lo sería la manera en la que las Américas protegían la democracia. Los Estados miembros de la OEA se habían dado sólidos argumentos para defenderla conjuntamente.
Los fundamentales son el compromiso por parte de todos los estados americanos de aceptar estas modalidades por las cuales otros estados pueden actuar para promover y inclusive la Secretaría General para promover y consolidar la democracia en un estado. Esto ha sido absolutamente pionero. Recién ahora, otros sistemas regionales están incorporando normas similares.
Hello, everyone. We are ready to resume. If you could return to the room, we would be grateful. Thank you.
Muy buenos días, se les invita a pasar a la sala. Vamos a continuar, por favor. Buenos días, pasemos a la sala para continuar.
¿Escuchan? Hola, ¿me escucha? Sí, ahora sí. Lo bajan encendido. Ah.
Apágalo, apágalo.
Hola, 1, 2, 3, 4. Pero acá va a hacer ruido conmigo.
Siga un poquito. Siga hablando un poquito.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Ponlo, ok. Lo ponemos aquí.
Are you Jason? Hola, un gusto.
Pero, hola, hola. Pero
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin our next session. If you could have your seats, we will continue our program. If anyone would like to move closer to the stage, there are some empty spaces up front. You're very welcome to come forward and fill them in if you would like. Please feel free to come forward if you'd like to have a better view of the proceedings. You're welcome to fill in any of the seats that are available. Our panel discussion is titled Delivering on Democracy, Pathways to Inclusive Growth and Institutional Resilience. I would now like to invite our panelists to the stage, Mr. Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Claudia Escobar de Mejia, Chair of the Voluntary Group for the Follow-up to the Inter-American Democratic Charter and Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the OAS, and our moderator, Ambassador Laura Gill, Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States. This conversation will take place in a dialogue format to promote an open and a dynamic exchange. As a reminder, you can continue to use the note cards that were shared at the beginning of the session or are available at the sides of the room. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Laura Gill.
¿Ahora sí? Ok, bueno. Ya es muy buenas tardes. Muy buenas tardes. Gracias a la maestra de ceremonias. Es un honor estar aquí. Y agradezco a Deco la invitación a moderar este panel. Es para mí un poco volver a mis orígenes, volver a mi época de analista, de opinadora, de conductora, de periodista. Entonces veremos si recuerdo cómo hacerlo bien. Estoy aquí para que discutamos sobre la Carta Democrática Interamericana y la prosperidad, la promesa de la Carta Democrática y la prosperidad. Y 24 años después podemos decir que hemos avanzado, hemos acompañado procesos difíciles, hemos fortalecido instituciones, hemos garantizado elecciones libres, pero creo que tenemos que hacernos algunas preguntas con honestidad. Entonces, les presento a los panelistas. A mi derecha, la embajadora Claudia Escobar. La embajadora Claudia es magistrada de la Corte de Apelaciones de Guatemala. Es un referente ético de lucha contra la corrupción, becaria de Harvard y Georgetown, Premio de Democracia 2017, compañera de Fellowship en the National Endowment for Democracy y hoy lidera el grupo de seguimiento a la Carta Democrática Interamericana. Y a mi izquierda está Jason Marsack, vicepresidente y director senior de la Adrienne Hart Latin American Center del Atlantic Council. Me honra conocerlo. Ha dedicado más de 25 años a estudiar la relación entre prosperidad económica y democracia en las Américas. Y desde la Atlantic Council impulsa el diálogo entre gobiernos, academia, sociedad civil y sector privado. Profesor en la Universidad George Washington, testigo experto en el Congreso de Estados Unidos, referente sobre migración, desarrollo y políticas públicas en la región. Combina rigor académico con visión práctica, que creo que es lo que todos necesitamos, ¿no? Entonces, ¿les parece si arrancamos un poco donde quedó la conversación anterior? El premio Nobel dijo que estamos en crisis, que no necesariamente otro tipo de gobiernos hubiesen podido hacerlo mejor, pero que la democracia está en crisis. Y esa crisis de la democracia se ha traducido también a los espacios multilaterales, que también se han visto disminuidos. Entonces, en ese contexto, una pregunta muy rápida para ambos. ¿Qué hemos logrado cumplir de la promesa de la Carta? ¿Qué no se ha logrado cumplir? Embajadora, ¿arranca usted?
No.
Bueno, entonces mientras pedimos ayuda aquí técnica, le voy a dar la palabra al doctor Marsa.
Bueno, muchas gracias, embajadora, y qué bueno, secretario general Ramdin, que está aquí para esta sesión también, y felicitaciones con esta iniciativa de tener ese discurso tan importante alrededor de la Carta Democrática, ya que estamos casi celebrando con fiesta grande el próximo año, 25 años de la Carta, ¿no? Cuando yo veo a la Carta, y qué bueno, embajador Escobar, estar en el panel con usted también, cuando yo veo la Carta, yo lo veo en el contexto de algunos de los logros, en mi opinión, más importantes de esta organización en los últimos casi 25 años, y algo más importante es como parte del proceso de la Cumbre de las Américas, ¿no? Que vamos a celebrar en República Dominicana, que bueno, que la embajadora está aquí, pero este ha sido como un logro, un entregable muy tangible de este proceso de cumbres, en lo cual hemos visto resultados muy concretos en los últimos como casi 25 años. Hemos visto cuándo fue importante implementar algunos de los artículos 18, 20, 21 en los últimos como casi 25 años para reforzar la importancia de la democracia, especialmente en momentos de amenazas a la democracia en la región. Y esta carta es algo que une la región alrededor en momentos críticos contra la amenaza hacia la democracia. Al mismo tiempo, sí, estamos como escuchamos en la última charla que estamos no solamente, bueno, yo escuché dos cosas. Yo escuché en momentos de crisis, pero también yo escuché que la próxima década va a ser crítica, ¿no? Entonces, como optimista en la vida, yo veo como las oportunidades en la próxima década para ver cómo podemos como actualizar nuestras democracias y al mismo tiempo cómo podemos actualizar las instituciones multilaterales para que esté aún más ágil y aún más tiene la oportunidad para responder aún más a las amenazas que vemos en el mundo, porque como escuchamos en el último discurso, las amenazas no son amenazas necesariamente a nivel de la región. Son amenazas globales, lo cual requiere aún más colaboración entre las instituciones subregionales con las instituciones de otras subregiones y por supuesto las instituciones a nivel global. Y aún más, yo pienso que sería que la ciudadanía quiere ver, como escuchamos en la última charla, la ciudadanía quiere ver resultados concretos de sus gobiernos. No quiere ver que se dice en inglés que the governments are delivering, ¿no? Y yo pienso que esto va a ser una tarea aún más importante para las instituciones multilaterales y para la democracia en general, para mostrar que estas instituciones están realmente funcionando para la ciudadanía de la región. Y sabemos en este salón la importancia de la OEA, pero a veces yo imagino que muchas personas en los pueblos de las Américas no entienden la importancia de instituciones así. Entonces, esto yo pienso muy importante para reforzar la importancia de no solamente de instituciones, pero de diálogo entre distintos actores y asegurando, bueno, hacemos Atlantic Council siempre, trabajamos con distintos partidos políticos, no nos importa si la persona es de la izquierda o de la derecha, nos importa que estamos como buscando soluciones concretas a desafíos compartidos.
Una pregunta de seguimiento sobre cómo nos pueden ayudar en eso, pero antes quería preguntarle a la embajadora lo siguiente. La carta es una promesa y una de las cosas que habló el premio Nobel era que la falta de confianza en la democracia se da por varias razones, pero una en particular es la corrupción, y usted es un referente de la lucha contra la corrupción. Y entonces, cuando esos escándalos estallan, es cuando se mide, cuando se ve el impacto de falta de confianza en los sistemas democráticos. Yo quería preguntarle a usted, ¿cuáles serían, desde su experiencia judicial, cuáles serían las medidas concretas que se necesitan para fortalecer en nuestro hemisferio la independencia judicial, la lucha contra la corrupción y desde ahí darle mayor vigor a la Carta?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Es un honor para mí participar en esta discusión, en este panel y estar con nuestro distinguido público. La Carta nos da un marco en el que nos podemos identificar y es aspiracional, como lo decíamos, y lo decía el premio Nobel. Estamos en un momento de crisis, de cuestionamientos. El contexto bajo el cual se firmó la Carta es muy distinto en ese momento, a principios de siglo, de lo que estamos ahora. Y una de las grandes crisis de la región han sido los escándalos de corrupción, la falta de confianza en las instituciones. Pero cuando hablamos de las instituciones tenemos que estar claros que debemos defender siempre esa separación de los poderes, y cuando la corrupción ataca el sistema de justicia es una de las crisis más graves, porque el sistema de justicia es el encargado de poder poner alto a los abusos de poder, a los casos de corrupción, cuando se hacen las denuncias, es ahí donde se resuelven esos grandes casos. Entonces, creo que es momento de enfocarnos en el Poder Judicial, cómo podemos garantizar que las autoridades que dirigen las instituciones de justicia sean personas de confianza, sean personas éticas, con conocimiento. Creo que uno de los retos más grandes que tenemos en nuestro hemisferio es no permitir que la política invada la justicia. Los indicadores de varios análisis demuestran que cuando el Estado de Derecho es firme, cuando las instituciones de justicia funcionan, también funciona la democracia, los índices de corrupción bajan y el progreso de los países es mejor. Y tomando en consideración los índices de transparencia internacional, vemos en Latinoamérica que los 3 países que generalmente están mejor en sus índices de transparencia, que son Chile, Paraguay y Costa Rica, son también quienes tienen mejores índices de Estado de Derecho y sus ciudadanos pues tienen más garantías y viven con mayor prosperidad. Entonces el aprendizaje que tendríamos que hacer es cómo fortalecemos las instituciones de justicia para que éstas sirvan a la democracia. Son la base y el fundamento de la democracia.
¿Y usted cómo cree que desde un organismo hemisférico podemos ayudar a fortalecer las instituciones judiciales sin caer en una intervención indebida?
Bueno, yo pienso que muchas veces como un rol muy importante de una institución multilateral es compartir buenas prácticas y lecciones aprendidas, ¿no? Muy difícil como meter en la situación individual de un país, pero hay mucho conocimiento a nivel de la OEA. Entonces, ¿cómo se puede como usar este conocimiento para compartir qué funciona y qué no funciona en temas del sistema judicial? Yo también quisiera como aprovechar, porque cuando estamos hablando sobre los desafíos a nivel global, lo cual ya tiene impacto en las Américas y va a tener aún más impacto en las Américas en los años que vienen, ¿no? Hemos hablado de inteligencia artificial, del efecto de desastres naturales, de la fragmentación del mundo. Estamos en el empiezo de la próxima época de las relaciones a nivel global. Estamos entrando en un periodo distinto como hemos entrado después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial a nivel global. Entonces, yo pienso como instituciones también, como la OEA, tienen la oportunidad para ver qué está funcionando, qué no está funcionando y cómo otras subregiones está trabajando a nivel de esos problemas y tener estas lecciones aprendidas para compartir con nuestros países de las Américas.
Sigamos por ese lado, porque el premio Nobel hablaba de al menos 3 grandes desafíos: el cambio demográfico, cambio climático y inteligencia artificial. Y que eran discusiones globales en las que la región también tiene que estar involucrado. Pero sin embargo, esta región que ha sido pionera en lo jurídico, absolutamente pionera, desde principios de 1900, hay 2 temas en los que está fuera de la conversación. Él mencionó uno, y es inteligencia artificial. Y yo agregaría otro, que son los temas espaciales. Mi pregunta sería, ¿cómo hacemos para traer a nuestros miembros y hacerlos participar en la conversación global sobre estos 2 grandes temas que van a cambiar nuestras economías, nuestras sociedades a futuro? Uno es la explotación del espacio y otro es la inteligencia artificial.
Yo pienso como a nivel yo pienso muy importante que aprovechamos este momento, y yo voy a decirlo en inglés, para que la región no es como un rule taker, but helps to be a rule maker, ¿no? Y yo pienso como en el pasado, la región ha sido siempre como un rule taker, ¿no? De lo que ha pasado a nivel global. Yo estuve justamente el otro día escribiendo un artículo sobre los últimos como 30 años y como las Américas ahora es aún más, América Latina y el Caribe es aún más insertado en temas globales, ¿no? Tenemos tratados de libre comercio como región con muchos países a nivel global. Hay organizaciones multinacionales, lo cual países de la región está afiliado. Entonces, en este momento, en este próximo como cambio muy grande a nivel global, la América Latina y el Caribe, yo pienso, está mucho mejor como posicionado para ser un referente como parte de esas discusiones, al revés de lo que había pasado en otras como grandes cambios a nivel global. Entonces, una organización como la OEA tiene la oportunidad para ver cuáles son algunas de las acciones abridas, cuáles son algunas de las políticas que podría permitir que la inteligencia artificial no permite aún más desigualdad en la región, pero permite como una oportunidad para acelerar el crecimiento económico para que es un poco más sostenible y más inclusivo, y eso tiene que ver con la conversación hoy día, porque cuando hay crecimiento económico aún más inclusivo, también tiene el efecto en reforzar la democracia, como hemos visto, ¿no? En Atlantic Council tenemos un índice que lanzamos cada año titulado como nuestro índice de libertad y prosperidad, y hemos visto un vínculo muy importante entre crecimiento económico inclusivo y apoyo para la democracia.
Embajadora, la palabra inclusión, participación, las palabras, o sea, los conceptos inclusión y participación están a todo lo largo del trabajo de Robinson y Acemoglu. Es una de las a más incluyentes las instituciones, más participativas, más fortalecidas y más fuerte la democracia. Entonces, le tengo una pregunta práctica para la OEA. Los estados me han confiado la relación con la sociedad civil y yo quería preguntarle a ambos, ¿cómo creen ustedes que en un continente con ciudadanías cada vez más críticas, cada vez más exigentes, cómo construimos una relación con la sociedad civil participativa, corresponsable, transformadora, y cómo ayudamos a los estados en estos procesos?
Bueno, en realidad la sociedad civil también tiene como diversas caras, ¿no? Y creo que hay que empezar un diálogo, pero también definir en qué áreas queremos que la sociedad civil se involucre y cómo poder aprovechar, digamos, esas perspectivas, y los países que tienen sociedades civiles más fuertes, obviamente, tienen también democracias más sólidas. Pongo, por ejemplo, el caso de Guatemala, donde cuando han existido crisis institucionales ha sido la sociedad civil la que ha salido a defender la democracia, pero hay momentos en los que se les tiene que dar espacio y otros momentos en que los gobiernos pues tienen que tomar las decisiones escuchando a la sociedad civil. Creo que debe ser un tema de alguna manera piramidal para que se vayan escuchando las bases de esa sociedad civil y vayan subiendo en la toma de decisiones, tomando en consideración lo que necesitan los ciudadanos que están organizados a través de estas entidades. Pero también, si tomamos en cuenta que sociedad civil es la academia, cuando nos estamos enfrentando a todos estos retos, a todos estos cambios, hay que reconocer que la región es muy diversa, y también pues son diversos los indicadores de desarrollo, y lo que deberíamos tratar también es mejorar los niveles de educación, mejorar los niveles de acceso a los recursos y al desarrollo para que esa sociedad civil sea más formada y capacitada para poder hacer propuestas que nos ayuden a mejorar.
Yo se le voy a hacer la pregunta con el sector privado. ¿Cómo usted ve el rol del sector privado en el multilateralismo, en un multilateralismo renovado?
Me encanta la pregunta. Me parece que el sector privado es absolutamente crítico, ¿no? nosotros trabajamos muy cercano con el sector privado, trabajamos muy cercano al sector privado y al sector público. Y yo pienso también, estoy totalmente de acuerdo con la embajadora Escobar también en el hecho sobre la sociedad civil, que siempre decimos la sociedad civil. Bueno, la sociedad civil tiene muchas caras, muchas posiciones distintas, muchos intereses distintos, pero yo menciono la sociedad civil porque yo pienso muy importante que hay aún más foros en lo cual hay diálogo entre la sociedad civil y el sector privado y los gobiernos. Yo sé que el proceso de las cumbres tiene como foros distintos, pero a veces como falta oportunidades para que todos los actores estén allí alrededor de la mesa. Y no solamente para hacer diálogo, porque hay muchos diálogos. La gente quiere resultados, ¿no? Quiere como entregables, quiere como ver como resultados concretos, porque el mundo está enfrentando algunos desafíos muy grandes. Entonces yo pienso en cada oportunidad muy importante siempre definir para qué estamos haciendo, para qué tenemos este diálogo, qué es el resultado deseado, qué queremos cumplir y después compartirlo. Aquí el rol del sector privado es absolutamente fundamental, ¿no? Porque el sector privado trabaja muy cercano y tiene una oportunidad para trabajar aún más cercano con el sector público. Y el sector privado tiene, por supuesto, intereses distintos que los gobiernos, pero yo pienso que muchas veces como ambos tienen algunos intereses muy en común, ¿no? Quiere crecimiento económico, quiere Estado de Derecho, quiere reglas muy claras para el sector privado para que pueda hacer negocio y pueda invertir en los países, y al mismo tiempo para instituciones así y para gobiernos también facilitar cuando hay reglas muy claras. Entonces, como a nivel general, yo pienso hay mucha coincidencia entre como lo que está trabajando generalmente los gobiernos para el bienestar de la sociedad y al mismo tiempo lo que está haciendo el sector privado, no porque está trabajando para el bienestar de la sociedad, pero está trabajando para como el crecimiento económico de la sociedad, porque esto también tiene implicaciones importantes en su habilidad de hacer negocio y de invertir aún más en los países.
Muchísimas gracias. Por muchos, digamos, ese diálogo, a profundizar con actores externos es todavía una deuda pendiente y quizás sea una salida para la creciente, digamos, el cuestionamiento al multilateralismo. Y le quería preguntar a la embajadora, usted ahora está presidiendo el grupo de seguimiento de la Carta Democrática, ya que estamos hablando de actores, de resiliencia, de instituciones. ¿Cuáles son los planes que tiene en este periodo que va a estar al frente?
Bueno, la Carta Democrática, el grupo tiene ya un plan que fue aprobado hace 2 años, en donde se han establecido algunas prioridades. Lo que es importante, creo yo, es proseguir con un esfuerzo de compartir buenas prácticas. Los países que han logrado fortalecer sus democracias, ¿qué es lo que han hecho? ¿Qué han hecho bien? ¿Cómo podemos aprender de esos países? Hacer también intercambio sur-sur. Es algo que es procedente, que creo que es oportuno en estos espacios. Pienso que el grupo se debe fortalecer, incluyendo a otros miembros que no están todavía integrados, y eso sería, digamos, una prioridad, invitar a los estados que no son parte del grupo voluntario de seguimiento para que estén ahí todos los estados, porque creo que necesitamos tener estas discusiones abiertas y ampliamente para que estemos en la misma página. La Carta Democrática fue un momento en que nos pusimos de acuerdo cuáles eran los principios que debíamos de defender, pero creo que hay otros aspectos que también se podrían incluir y que el espacio de discusión es ese foro.
Les quiero, ayer en la presentación del Grupo de Apoyo al Comité Jurídico Interamericano, el secretario de Asuntos Jurídicos de la OEA dijo que hemos hecho mucho, pero que no siempre hemos sabido contarlo. Entonces yo quería preguntarle a ambos, ¿cómo se cuenta la historia de la OEA? ¿Cómo la contamos mejor? ¿Tienen alguna sugerencia?
Bueno, sí, yo puedo compartir desde mi perspectiva, bueno, de afuera, ¿no? Y por supuesto yo no estoy al tanto de todo lo que está haciendo la OEA para compartir sus logros, pero yo pienso que, bueno, como la comunicación hoy día es importante ver como el hecho que las fórmulas, la metodología para comunicar está cambiando, ¿no? Yo hago cada semana un video de 1 minuto sobre lo que está pasando en las Américas, ¿no? Porque yo sé que la gente no tiene la habilidad, no hay mucho interés en ver cosas más de 1 minuto y a veces hablo por 90 segundos. Pero yo pienso como hay como nuevas metodologías para comunicar, como el videos muy cortos sobre algunos de los logros, un video de lo que estamos haciendo hoy día, ¿no? Más como oportunidades para hablar con la prensa en la región sobre lo que está logrando como parte de todas las discusiones importantes que está haciendo aquí. Y también tener como una comunidad de validadores sobre la importancia de este nivel de discusión a nivel multilateral, personas quienes no están necesariamente afiliados con la institución, pero personas quienes entienden la importancia de la organización. Entonces yo pienso como el hecho que la comunicación está cambiando en una manera muy rápida y hay muchas oportunidades para aprovechar de esos cambios. No solamente en la OEA, pero cualquier como institución multilateral, a veces es difícil como comunicar con la gente, la ciudadanía, lo que está haciendo y la importancia, ¿no? Y a veces yo pienso que hay discusiones más institucionales, lo que necesitan pasar, pero ¿cómo puede traducirlo a cosas más tangibles que afecta la vida cotidiana de los pueblos, ¿no? Entonces, yo pienso que hay muchas oportunidades para hacerlo, y especialmente para ver cuáles son, en quién quiere influir, con quién quiere hablar y con quién no está hablando ahora, de personas quienes son muy importantes para entender aún más la importancia de esas instituciones.
La OEA, que ha estado tan involucrada en el proceso guatemalteco en los últimos años, ¿usted cree que la ciudadanía guatemalteca entiende el trabajo de la OEA? ¿Y qué le recomendaría a otros países que siente a la OEA más alejada?
Bueno, creo que lo puedo también vincular a lo que hablábamos anteriormente. Creo que esta es una historia de éxito. Generalmente las noticias ponen las historias negativas y pocas veces se enfocan en las historias positivas. Y aquí el caso de Guatemala es un ejemplo en donde la OEA ha sido muy activa, le ha prestado atención, pero también Guatemala lo ha solicitado. No ha sido solo la organización quien se ha acercado, sino que se le han abierto las puertas y la organización ha estado dispuesta a intervenir. Y no es un caso únicamente, sino que también tenemos un diferendo con Belice. Durante muchos años, históricamente, había un conflicto y la OEA desde hace más de 15 años tiene una misión especial en la zona de adyacencia que ayuda a los dos países a acercarse mientras llega una resolución de la Corte Internacional de Justicia. Entonces ese es otro ejemplo en cómo la OEA ha intervenido positivamente y esos casos deben de ser contados. En el caso de la defensa de la democracia, Guatemala estuvo en una crisis institucional después de las elecciones del 2023, donde había un grupo de personas antidemócratas que no quería reconocer la elección y estuvo tratando de evitar la toma de poder del presidente Arévalo. Por lo tanto, la OEA puso atención a esto. Se celebraron más de 10 sesiones del Consejo Permanente, pero también la Secretaría General hizo visitas al país. Los embajadores fueron, ayudaron a la ciudadanía que estaba también defendiendo el voto. Y se logró hacer una transición pacífica. Guatemala tiene más de 40 años de vivir en democracia y en ese momento crítico el apoyo y el acompañamiento de la OEA fue muy importante. Así que yo invitaría a los países que cuando tienen problemas internos, poder recurrir a un órgano en donde todos somos parte y podemos pedir ese acompañamiento de los otros países que también tienen interés en que en la región no se pierda otro país y no se pierda otra democracia. Ya hay 3 países de la región que no están en el foro y que esos retrocesos pues no quisiéramos verlos más en la región.
Muchas gracias. Quienes hemos sido profesores, hemos dictado clase, quienes hemos sido comentaristas en medios, quienes hemos sido funcionarios en gobiernos y quienes ahora estamos ocupando un puesto en un organismo multilateral, siempre tenemos la misma pregunta. ¿Pero para qué sirve esto si en tal lado no logró los resultados que prometió? Y yo creo, y creo que ustedes estarían de acuerdo conmigo, es que sí, la Carta es aspiracional. Sigue siendo una promesa, pero cumplió en muchos lados. Pero la Carta, lo más importante de la Carta es que nos refleja quiénes queremos ser. Y ese es nuestro norte. Y eso es lo que nunca podemos perder de vista, que plasma la comunidad hemisférica que queremos ser. Entonces, como ustedes en sus países construyen la democracia día a día, nosotros aquí también en el multilateralismo construimos la OEA con cada decisión cotidiana, no con los grandes discursos. Cuando llega el documento, ese tiene que ser nuestro norte y nuestra inspiración. Y tenemos, ambos panelistas tienen vidas muy ocupadas y citas que atender, entonces gracias por habernos acompañado hasta aquí. Ha sido un honor estar con ambos y a Jason le vamos a pedir que nos ayude a facilitar el diálogo con todos los actores. Sí. Un honor. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you to our panelists and to Ambassador Gill for such an insightful dialogue. We will now move on to the closing segment of our program. To offer closing remarks, I have the pleasure of inviting Ms. Anika Silva-Leander, Head of North America and Permanent Observer to the United Nations for International IDEA.
Excelencias, distinguidos colegas. As we come to the close of today's gathering, I want to begin by thanking the Organization of American States, the Embassy of Switzerland, and all the distinguished speakers and participants who have made this discussion so rich, so relevant, and so necessary. It has been an honor for International IDEA to co-organize this important event and discussion. I represent International IDEA, which is an intergovernmental organization with 35 member states, and we have the mandate to strengthen democracy worldwide. 10 of our member states are also member states of the OAS. Switzerland is currently the chair of the Council of Member States of International IDEA, and I want to extend a warm thanks to Switzerland for its steadfast support over the past year. We are a think and a do tank, and we produce global comparative knowledge on democracy. We convene democratic reformers across regions and sectors, and we provide technical assistance on democratic reforms to more than 60 countries around the world. We also advocate for democracy in multilateral fora. And this year, we also celebrate our 30th anniversary at a difficult time for democracy, as we have discussed today. But today we have also celebrated. We have celebrated the enduring promise of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. We have celebrated that democracy and prosperity, and we have acknowledged that they are inseparable, and that human dignity and freedom remain the foundation of peace and progress in the Americas. That promise is as urgent today as it was 24 years ago when the Charter was adopted, and perhaps even more so. Across the hemisphere, citizens are demanding that governments listen, that institutions work, and that democracies deliver. Our Global State of Democracy report paints a stark picture. Democracy is declining worldwide, across both established and newer democracies. Yet we know, and we have confirmed today, that democracy remains the best framework for achieving sustainable, equitable, and inclusive development. Our latest report, set for release next week ahead of the World Social Summit in Doha, examines the vital link between democracy, social development, and prosperity. And the findings of our report echo today's discussion. Democracy is more than a political system. It is a driver of social and economic prosperity. But when it fails to deliver, public trust erodes. Using our Global State of Democracy indices, our data show that democracies outperform authoritarian regimes on nearly every measure of human well-being. Levels of gender and social equality are almost 50% higher in democracies. Basic welfare like education, health, social protection is 30% higher, and corruption is half as prevalent. Our data also shows that when democracy deepens, equality expands. Where institutions are transparent and accountable, trust grows. And where citizens participate meaningfully, societies become more resilient, more cohesive, and more prosperous. But our findings also carry a warning. When democracy weakens, these gains unravel fast. Corruption rises, inequality widens, civic trust collapses, and the social contract erodes. And we have seen this pattern too often in recent years, including in the Americas. The good news is that the Americas still hold enormous democratic potential. Many of the countries have built institutions that are models for electoral integrity, gender inclusion, and participatory governance. Yet they also face common challenges: democratic fatigue, inequality, disinformation, and the corrosive effects of corruption. The task before us is not only to defend democracy, but to renew its capacity to deliver. And that means investing in the institutions that safeguard it: electoral management bodies, parliaments, courts, and civil society. It also means rethinking how we invest in democratic resilience. As our research suggests, democracy is a form of infrastructure. It underpins everything else we build: security, prosperity, and peace. And it deserves the same attention, investment, and innovation that we devote to roads, to energy, to defense. And here in the Americas, we have the frameworks, we have the expertise, and we have the shared history to lead this renewal. And the Inter-American Democratic Charter remains one of the strongest regional compacts for democracy in the world. Its principles have guided transitions, mediated crisis, and inspired reform. But the Charter's real promise lies in how we carry it forward, how we translate its word into action that citizens can feel in their daily lives: fairer economies, safer communities, more inclusive representation, and greater trust in the institutions that serve them. International IDEA is proud to stand beside the OAS, member states, and civil society across this hemisphere and globally in advancing that mission. We will continue to provide the data, the analysis, the policy support that help democracies deliver, not just elections, but equality, not just institutions, but inclusions, not just stability, but shared prosperity. So let this anniversary, a double anniversary, renew our resolve to make democracy deliver dignity, justice, and opportunity for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Silva Leander. To conclude our event, I would like to invite Mr. Sebastian Kraljevic, Secretary for Strengthening Democracy at the OAS, to take the floor.
Muchas gracias por estar acá esta mañana. Muchas gracias a Suiza, que hizo posible este evento. Muchas gracias a IDEA, que nos acompañó. Muchas gracias a cada uno de ustedes por sus felicitaciones por esta jornada, aunque deben saber que yo llevo solo 100 días en la Secretaría y esto viene de mucho más atrás. Así que quiero un gran aplauso para el equipo de la Secretaría que hizo esto posible y nos reunió acá con este evento de gran nivel. Esto es parte de un mandato de los Estados, parte de un mandato de la Carta Democrática Interamericana, que en su artículo 26 llama a la OEA a promover los valores democráticos. Parte de lo que hemos conversado hoy día, parte de los desafíos, cuando el profesor Acemoglu nos contaba que especialmente la gente joven ve poco reconocimiento a la democracia, es parte de lo que tenemos que empezar a revertir. Y ahí nuestra convicción es que la OEA puede hacer mucho más en difundir los valores democráticos. Tenemos un lugar privilegiado para ello al estar fuera de los debates nacionales. En cada una de nuestras sociedades hay creciente polarización, cada vez cuesta más encontrar espacios de acuerdo, pero en la medida que la OEA venga desde otro lugar, desde lo multilateral, sin ser parte, sin elegir trincheras en las naciones, puede promover estos valores mucho mejor y vamos a hacer eso con mucha mayor insistencia. Así que nos queda alta la vara hacia el 25 aniversario de la Carta el próximo año, pero quiero que nos estén siguiendo, revisando, fiscalizando este año porque queremos hacer mucho más en esa área. Queremos que la promesa de la democracia se haga carne, especialmente en las generaciones más jóvenes, ser capaces de colaborar a que haya nuevos liderazgos, ser capaces de abrir puertas de acuerdo, puertas de construcción de consenso, y eso es parte del sello que queremos hacer, especialmente de cara a este 25 aniversario de la Carta, que esperamos tenerles nuevamente acá con un programa de aún más alto nivel que hoy, y esa es la promesa que hacemos nosotros hoy día. Así que por eso, muchas gracias por su presencia, por su compromiso y por trabajar cada día por mejores democracias en la región.
Thank you, Secretary Kraljevic. Before we close, I would like to reiterate, on behalf of the Organization of American States, our sincere gratitude to the Embassy of Switzerland, to the United States, for their generous support and collaboration in making this event possible. Thank you all of you for joining us today to celebrate democracy in the Americas, not only as a system of government, but as a shared commitment to freedom, inclusion, and prosperity for all. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.